Okay, everyone, welcome back. So we're going to pick up. Dennis and I talked in between, and we're going to backtrack just a half step and go back to the LA school. I wanted to make a couple of comments about the LA school and then open for questions you may have about the LA school. As Dennis indicates, it's a very important uh, sort of new beginning as they make their claims about being the postmodern city and how we'll all become like LA if we only last a few more years. But so a couple of things about the LA school. Um, so the first is while Michael Deere is certainly the foremost advocate, and his book that even before we had our conference and before we did the City Revisited, he had the book from Chicago to LA, meaning that the old Chicago school was being replaced by the wonderful new LA school, and was making full claims for a fully developed school intellectual body of scholars there in LA. But and his book about from Chicago to LA is indeed a useful book, and it's sort of recapped in his chapter in our book, The City Revisited. But one important thing to note as you look at the articles in The City Revisited, you'll see there are two other LA scholars who essentially argue that the LA school is wrong, or at least it doesn't take account of factors that are actually present in Los Angeles. Amy Bridges brings our attention to Janitors for Justice, a protest movement which succeeded a union movement. That's very Chicago school style, new Chicago school style, in the sense that we're looking at political activity making a difference, and she points out that they won their battle and that they got higher wages and so forth, and were able to get some other things solved, and that therefore sort of a grounds up social movement, activist role, political decision making, all is what is going on in LA, this supposedly fragmented place where nothing happens politically, and it's all just social, diaspora and sprawl, like Wu-Jay was talking about in his comments. Something else is going on in LA, and it's not captured by the Los Angeles school that Michael Deere is acting as spokesman for. And the second piece by Steve Erie, who doesn't actually live in Los Angeles. He's a scholar in San Diego, but he's a very major scholar of Los Angeles politics and government. Steve Erie draws our attention to that LA government is very different from Chicago, our Chicago experience with Chicago politics, although we have examples like McPier, which are similar, in that in Los Angeles, every major function, or a lot of major functions, are not governed by the mayor and the city council, but they're governed by these independent bodies. The port is governed by a different body. The airport is governed by a different body. The water system is governed by a different body. And yes, the mayor sometimes makes some appointments and so on, but they're not just the mayor's lackeys. They're not the mayor's cabinet. And so he's talking about what in Dennis's new book, which hopefully he'll talk to us just a bit about at the end here, and that we will have later Evan McKenzie speaking to us in a later class. Private government, the government that isn't where, I mean, we think of in the model of the American city, well, the city council and the mayor, decide everything. And so politics in that sense is critical and important. But in this case, even in LA, which is supposedly this different postmodern city, that isn't true. The mayor and the city council yes, it's even more fragmented than the sense of sprawl. If there are all these different towns and cities and suburban areas, even within what is supposed to be Los Angeles itself, the government is internally fragmented in a way that is not entirely familiar to Chicagoans, where the mayor, in particular, if you're thinking about the mayor's daily or the mayor Emanuel, the boss mayors, the builder mayors, they had more power than the mayor does in Los Angeles, whoever the mayor is in Los Angeles. And so the LA school is interesting. First, this particular strong challenge and vision that Michael Dear and his colleagues do indeed present in terms of urban studies is contradicted by other scholars in the same area by these two different things: political agency on the one hand, and the division into independent units that defy the power even of the mayor and the city council. And so I just wanted to interject that. Of course, you've read in the book, but we're trying to put this in perspective and to bring your attention to how to think about what is meaningful in the Los Angeles school and in the challenges even within the people who study Los Angeles. But we wanted to take a time for you to raise questions. Some of you have direct experience with Los Angeles. So let's take a few minutes and raise your questions or make your comments about Los Angeles and how convincing Michael Dear's version of the LA school is, or how it may have helped you understand something you didn't understand about the study of urban studies before you read about the Los Angeles school in specific. So just unmute yourself and any order. Is there anything about Los Angeles school you found challenging? Is there anything you found truthful? Is there anything that you've got questions about? Now, you can't all be silent. This will be a very dull class. I've told Dennis you all are great and you really understand cities and you're bringing a lot of interesting perspectives, and then you're all being quiet.
So I'll pose a question that perhaps people may want to tangle with, and that is, does the LA school accurately describe Los Angeles? Or alternatively, does the LA school describe any other city? What do you find that you recognize in it?
So
sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, okay. Yes. I mentioned this before. I'm from LA originally, so I was particularly interested in reading about the Los Angeles school and trying to understand the ways that they can conceive of the city. And, you know, the spatial disaggregation of the entire city, of course, makes it definitely look like it's kind of ungovernable because it's so spread out and there are so many distinct you know, areas of the city that don't really have a lot in common. And it almost could feel like you're driving to a entirely different city if you go a few miles east or west or north or south, you know, from wherever you are. But I don't know, I wasn't as convinced that the, you know, the city government is as weak and kind of impotent as they make it, you know, as they describe it to be. It seems like, it just seems like, at least in my experience, I worked for the city for about 6 months, and it seemed like they were, you know, pretty in tune and connected to the areas that they live in or that they represent. I think one problem is that unlike Chicago, for example, which has 50 aldermen, LA has 12 city council members for a city that's what, 1.5 million or 2 million more people than Chicago itself. So the sheer amount of people represented, I think, does contribute to, you know, maybe a less responsive and less small d democratic government that can seem more disorganized and just kind of inept, but it doesn't seem to me like it's completely powerless. So I was a little skeptical of the characterization.
Well, if I may interject, Steve Erie, in his contribution in the book, says that the LA scholars were inattentive to the political development of institutions. So Ryan, I wonder if one of the things that contributes to the LA school scholars' notions of political gridlock is that they actually don't study political institutions or even decision making. They infer from a geographic pattern that politics has, that the metropolis has become ungovernable, but nowhere do they provide empirical evidence that that's the case. Direct evidence.
Yeah, that's actually, I would agree with that. I think that it's a theory that makes sense a lot based on the geography, but not as much based on at least my lived experience and what I saw, working for the city.
Interesting. It helps to know about a place.
Any other comments on Los Angeles before we move to New York?
One quick comment about the Los Angeles school, to be honest, because I'm not too familiar with Los Angeles, but I think that this process that they're describing with the suburban areas, the fragmentation, I mean, granted, not every city is bound to be Los Angeles-like, but I think that there is something about that for every place that suffers some sort of process of suburbanization, the sort of fragmented, gated communities. There are cases even in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and so I feel like even though we shouldn't generalize to that extent of thinking that Los Angeles is somehow the future, I think it says a lot about suburbs in general, and especially the richer portion of suburbs, to say the least.
One of the conclusions we have in the final chapter is that as you try and figure out what would a theory have to have to be useful in our current studies, one of them that we concluded was that you would have to study the metropolitan region, that it wouldn't be enough to study the city within the city boundary, the official city boundaries like Chicago, but you'd have to study the Chicago metropolitan region, and the same would be true in LA or any other city. So, bringing the suburbs in is indeed important. And in fact, in the 21st Century Chicago book, we devote a lot of attention to suburban studies, and people like Missy Marutson and Connie Mixon do study the cities, do study the suburbs, and are trying to add actual content. Most of the scholars who've written on cities have not written on the suburbs. There are only a few major books on the suburbs, and that's one of the things that at least some members of our new Chicago school or the preschool are attempting to correct. So yes, Los Angeles scholars were correct. We do need to think about the whole region, or what might some others call sprawl, and that the center city is not the whole story. That is a valid contribution of the Los Angeles school. Dennis, maybe you want to go on to New York and we'll stir up some more questions along the way. Oh, go ahead, David.
Thank you. It's just that what Rodrigo mentioned about these like suburban areas in Los Angeles made me think about what we talked before about how transportation can shape the structure and dynamic of a city, and you can feel the difference. I find Chicago and New York to be kind of similar in that aspect, like a downtown with its public transportation system, the subway that you can use, and actually reach to places. This reminds me of Haussian urban structure, much more of European cities, while Los Angeles is a jungle of highways. And I think it was mentioned that it was like prioritized by private commissions that start organizing in this way. And I remember being in LA and not being able to notice which is downtown. Is Hollywood downtown? I never could figure it out. And it's not something that happens to me in other cities. So, and it was just the thing with transportation. And I mean, you can not be in LA, especially in California, and not have a car. It's really annoying. But in Chicago, it's livable, and in New York too. Just that.
Yes. So there is something unique about LA. And yet, I just, before we leave it, want to quickly interject. There's something about LA that also can be found probably all over the world. Anyone who's been to other cities, practically anywhere, can testify that there are defended enclaves everywhere in the world. That there is a kind of, because of the inequality associated with the globalized economy, an inevitable replication of that inequality in urban development. And it may not look exactly like LA, but it will have some of the general features, recognizable features. So we don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can say, well, the LA school, whatever its shortcomings, alerted us to something that we want to look at. And one of its great contributions, perhaps its most signal contribution, is it reawakened urban scholarship. It really was like inserting a cattle prod into the urban community and making people think again in refreshing ways. So let me turn to New York. John Mollenkoff at page 169 and 170 provides what I think is the most precise discussion of the New York school in the book. And it is that we can understand New York as a politics of ethnicity, but not necessarily of neighborhoods. So that we would say, all of us would probably say, well, Chicago has been powerful, that the neighborhoods have been powerful. In New York, in the history of New York, a polyglot metropolis with a multitude of different immigrant groups over time, has developed a politics in which groups must deal with one another. And they've done so through a political system centered in the boroughs, and then in a system of bargaining that results in a governmental structure in which groups constantly give and take. So a study of New York has certainly had some of the most famous party machines in urban history, as has Chicago. But one of the differences that emerges in that literature is that the New York machine has tended to be more complex in its ethnic makeup, its loyalties, and the way that it operated. Let me just read you a sentence or two from John Mollenkoff's piece. Let's see. New York certainly does loom large in the discussion of global cities. Literature also does not constitute a New York school, however, because it focuses on the global system of cities and the internal dynamics thought to be more or less common to key nodes. Then he goes on to note that globalization works itself out in different places in different ways. This is his rebuttal to the notion that because all places are globalized virtually today. They all tend to converge, as the LA school would have you believe. Mollenkoff's argument is powerful, and that is that local political structures and systems are resistant to change, that culture is resilient, that it lasts over time, and that therefore that we can understand New York even when we acknowledge that all cities are operating within a global system that might seem to lead them to be similar, that the study of New York shows us very clearly that it retains its particular and peculiar style of politics, as does Janet Abu-Ghalad's chapter 2, in which she shows us that Chicago has also retained its particularities in an era of globalization. So one of the things I want, and here I'm not going to comment on the Chicago school yet. That is to say, us, the recent Chicago school. I'm going to save that for last. But I want to read Bob Beauregard's point on the uniqueness of cities. Page 195. Individual cities are unique only in a specific sense. That is, we choose to perceive and emphasize certain qualities and not others. That is, urban theories could think that places are completely different, but they're overlapping and similar in many ways and unique in others. And the task of urban scholarship is to disentangle those uniform qualities, those qualities that tend to lead in them to become similar, such as the rise of defended communities, the multiplying of gated communities, the insertion of a globalized middle class, professional elite at the urban center, including in Los Angeles, all of these pressures that make them similar also find points of resistance to what would otherwise make them similar. What I would suggest is that these dimensions of analysis, the theories, may be all true at the same time. That is, rather than choose among them, we can ask ourselves a different kind of question. What do they apply to? What do they seem to tell us? What do they, in what sense is the LA school true for other places? And in what sense is it misleading? In what sense does the New York school tell us about New York, not other places? But in what sense does it tell us about other places? And in what sense does the Chicago school today tell us about other places? The Chicago school of today, for example, how much would we want to generalize from it? I'll return to my original remarks as we struggle to put together a Chicago school. Well, inevitably, we were influenced by the peculiar history of the city we live in, with one of the longest lasting, gives us one of the longest lasting, richly textured history of machine politics in all of America. A machine politics that, although in a different form, actually lasted until remarkably late, even after it was gone in other places. That gives us the notion that in Chicago, politics is powerful. It's a powerful mediating force that resists, that makes it possible for human beings to make decisions about their present and their future even in the face of large-scale changes. I will give you inequality, for example. People today would argue that cities do not have the resources to resist. They do not have sufficient resources to make up for the rapid spread of poverty in the United States, the grotesque levels of inequality that have emerged. Chicago, other cities clearly show it makes a difference. The places have some kind of capacity to do something. And Chicago in particular shows that to be the case through the vigor of its nonprofit sector, which is a multitude of powerful organizations, well-funded organization, even in its business community, and its ability to support common enterprises, sometimes bad, sometimes good. The Olympics would have been bad. At the same time, the business community can do good, other good things. So let me pause here and ask the question. All are true at the same time. I'd like some of you to help me to expand on that point. If they're true all at the same time, in what sense are all of them true? What are the statements in all three schools that are all true? I know this is a good question because I'm looking at the puzzled expressions going, oh my God, what's the answer to this one?
One of the three things that I guess that would be the same across all three would be that, I guess I'm asking, I don't know for sure, but would it be that they have a certain political drive or that a certain political force shaped how each of the cities developed? Would that be true across all three situations?
The LA schools seem to leave politics out, so I don't think so. I don't think, yeah.
No, and I'm just considering because, well, even with the LA thing, obviously, we talk about how fragmented their structure kind of is, but there seems to be, I guess, they I guess lack the cohesion that Chicago and New York would have in terms of politics, but there obviously still is some sort of political foundation there that the subsets seem to have. So what would you say to that?
I would sort of recall back to Dick's comments about Amy Bridges, Steve Airy's pieces, in which they are LA scholars, but they contest the LA school. So this is a case in which my statement that all of these schools may be true. This is an instance in which it doesn't appear to be the case. The implication of the LA scholars that politics is, that Los Angeles is ungovernable, maybe it isn't true.
Daniel, you had your hand up.
Seeking clarification, is the question what attributes do the three schools have in common, or is the question what attributes do individual schools have which we can apply to the others?
Yes.
What should we be holding on to from each of them?
The latter.
Okay.
Latter. In what sense?
Well,
how are all three? On what dimensions are all three true?
okay. I would suggest politics matter, Chicago school, individual agency matters, preschool, multimodal disorganization influences outcomes from LA school as three potential things that we can say are true.
Okay.
And what would you take from the New York school?
I'm not so certain. I'm not completely convinced there is a New York school.
Mhm,
I think saying I like Jane Addams doesn't make you a school.
mhm.
Sorry, not Jane Addams.
Jane Jacobs.
Thank you. Jacobs doesn't make you a school.
Maybe that's true of our preschool. We disagree about all sorts of things.
One thing that I was thinking about in relation to after I said the comment about the LA school and kind of said that I don't think it really applies. I think that on second thought, there is one area where I think it applies quite well, actually, and it's an issue that's unique to LA in terms of its magnitude, but also affects Chicago and New York. And it's related to homelessness and the way that disaggregated power in the city of LA can impact how homelessness is dealt with. So on the west side, you have Beverly Hills, Brentwood, and Santa Monica kind of, all lined up. One is in 3 different cities representing each, but all the same metro area. But each takes a very radically different approach. Beverly Hills is notoriously, what's the right word? Aggressive about their enforcement. So you will never see someone panhandling on Rodeo Drive. But if you go into Santa Monica on the promenade, which is like the main tourist area, you'll see tent cities and a lot of homelessness and a lot of these, really sad scenes that really affect how the city kind of operates and the tourism and all that kind of stuff. So, these powerful, all very wealthy, all powerful enclaves with separate, structures within them can really push an issue, can really create a very disturbing outcome in the sense that there's no cooperation amongst an issue that all 3 have a vested interest in. And that kind of thing, while the homelessness problem is not as bad in Chicago, for example, that kind of thing, seems like in an age of globalization where there's so much power being concentrated in an elite few in all 3 cities, that kind of thing seems like it can manifest itself in Chicago and New York, even if they don't have the same history of urban sprawl.
Mhm.
Just have a quick observation about the 3 schools. So I would say that LA school is saying that globalization leads to a service industry that makes the city more fragmented. But the other 2 schools are saying that the globalization leads to a service industry that concentrates on making the cities a place to both work and live. But the common theme for the 3 schools seems to be that for all 3 cities, there is an influx of immigrants and a resulting animosity toward the immigrants and their eventual political incorporation.
That's a good point. Any other comments about how they're all 3 true?
Can I take a stab at that? I love Wu Jay because he's kind of like helping me. Where he just touched on about the immigrants, and I guess this goes back to my thought regarding politics being the driver in all 3 areas. I guess the way I was framing it in my mind was that a lot of these situations, even with New York and in Chicago, you looking at the Great Migration, you go to New York, 1800s, so forth, you had a lot of immigrants that flooded into these places. And so for each, whether, for each group, whether ethnic, racial, or whatever, they needed some sort of representation, which brought organization. And by that happening, I guess we kind of call it interest politics today. There was some sort of sense of advocacy that they needed for space, for work, for living conditions, for, all those sorts of things. So I guess that's why my mind was thinking in each of those three cities, a driver was, you know, that advocacy for whatever group needed something, be it jobs, be it living spaces, be it, you know, I don't know, equal rights, fair treatment. You know, we can go on and on about what voting rights. We can go on about what the different causes were, but I guess that was kind of where my mind was heading, if that makes sense at all.
Veronica, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I can turn on my camera because
That's
my
okay.
Wi-Fi is really unstable. But I was thinking the same thing as Sean when he made his first comment about political agency. We know that the Chicago school has that, and the New York, I would say, has that as well. But in terms of LA, I was thinking about how you mentioned, Professor Simpson, the J2J movement that happened there, and how from there LA started seeing more Latinos involved in politics. So I would argue based on that, that even the LA school has political agency in that sense. I know Sean mentioned about immigrants trying to advocate for themselves back in time, right? But I would say even now in recent times, based on that movement, the political agency also exists to some extent in the LA school, even though it's so fragmented.
Other comments?
So I've been struggling to get my head around the distinctions between these schools. I'm a quantitativist. I tend to think in concrete terms, which is not necessarily useful in this class. But the distinction, the biggest distinction I seem to be seeing between them, it seems to be a fight between the city is like Chicago. No, the city is like LA. No, the city is like New York. No, the city is really like Chicago. And so much of this reading, each of the scholars seems to be looking at the situation in one area, in one city, and some of that's limited by their method selection. It's hard to do a case study in 400 cities. It's actually impossible to do a case study in 400 cities. But why should we think any of these cities studied by itself should provide generalizable conclusions?
Comments? Well, my answer to that is, and that's the role of urban theory, is to point the way toward the ability to generalize. One exercise that I used to make my students go through is to say, okay, now I want you to describe, it could be anything. In this case, it's a city, in one paragraph, no more than one paragraph. And of course, people really wrestled with this question. Well, that's the ability to generalize. And it is impossible to do without a point of view, without somewhere where you get purchase. And that's what each of these offers. Let me say what my paragraphs would be. In fact, I'll reduce it to like a sentence. And then I want to see if you agree with that, with these extreme generalizations or not. This is a way in which I believe all of these schools are true at the same time. That is to say, there's one thing I'll say about all the schools that apply everywhere. And then I'll say something about how the schools differ in their answers to important questions that concern us. The LA school, the metropolis is extremely fragmented. I don't know how to get more brief than that. I'll say increasingly fragmented. Now let me go with extremely. That's true. Does anybody know any place that that doesn't refer to in most countries? Okay, good. 2, New York School, granted, if there is one, that New York can be described as an arena of negotiated terrain. That is to say, it's polyglot, there are many groups, but they have found a way to constantly negotiate their differences. Would you agree that virtually all metropolitan areas have a capacity for negotiating the differences among groups? Go. I thought somebody might jump on that one. And 3, Chicago. I'm at this point going to pause and cheat a little and say, what should my sentence be? Why should I give it to you? What should my sentence be? I did 2 out of 3. That's not bad.
You're gonna say something, a political machine? No, never mind. Someone said Frig.
Okay, anybody else?
Agency of politics in general.
Politics is a mechanism of human agency. I think that could be said better. I think it could be written more elegantly, but would you all agree that would apply to every place? Voila, we have found a respect in which all of these schools are true at the same time. Now I want to read just a little bit from Bob Beauregard's brilliant essay. I think it's brilliant. Bob is always brilliant, in which he summarizes with 4 points that may help to bring things together. There at page 196. First point, page 196. Mediated, any city's uniqueness emerges from its specific embeddedness in time and space. So if we want to say, despite the fact that we found something that's true for all, that urban, the way in the respect in which all of these theories are true, cities nevertheless, we must recognize that cities are different. Bob is telling us any city's uniqueness emerges from a specific embeddedness in time and space. This doesn't mean that cities are fundamentally in every respect different from one another. It means that each has a particular history of development and that there can be located in time and space. Second, city-based urban theories suffer from the presumption that the named city is meaningful because its dynamics and conditions are deeply, quote, real. The city, it is being claimed, is neither fictional nor, even more importantly, symbolic. If it were either, the city's radical uniqueness would be trivialized. The city's unmediated qualities are what compel our attention. So we tend in our analysis to be attracted to noting how they differ, how they're unique, how they're radically unique, more than we focus upon how they're similar. And that with urban theory, we're not, well, let me pause there. Third, city-based urban theories distort the role of space and place and thereby undermine the necessity for historical geography. Space must be part of any urban theory, but this does not mean that urban theory should be spatially confined and labeled. To propose that urban theory should be crafted around the quality of a single city, such as Los Angeles, is to embrace space as absolute space. That seems to contradict the first point, that we can understand cities, or they're embedded in time and space, but he's saying something different here. Yes, we recognize they're located in time and space, but that doesn't mean that urban theory should only conclude that they are determined by their history in the way in which they're located in time and place. City-based theories, therefore, should not be based upon a narrow conception of the object of study. They should be employed in the search for what we could say about how cities may look enough like one another that we can have what we could call a coherent urban literature. Otherwise, we retreat sort of back to a babble of tongues in which we think that every place can be described without reference to anywhere else. We really can't retreat from theory, regardless of the problems that theory may pose. And the discussion today clearly showed that we recognize the shortages of urban theory. Nevertheless, I would argue that we really don't have any choice. That's the only place we can go, is in the search for theory. I want to end with questions about cities that you may want to engage. And that is a question. Will the metropolis fracture more and more? We have agreed that metropolitan areas are spatially fragmented. What does the future hold? Will they fracture? Will cities be contests for the context for positive change? Here we come to a crux of the matter. I don't think I'm being very clear, so let me try this again. Are cities destined to become the places that express and are helpless before the forces that pull us apart, that we see, for example, in our national politics today? The extreme ideological contestation, the inability to reach a center in our politics to negotiate differences? Or will they become the context for a positive change that mediates these forces? Can we look to cities as the place in our future as a counterbalance to what I see today is almost a despair about our ability to even have a functioning democracy? I don't know if I've posed it quite clearly, but let me stop there and ask if there's any reactions to that. Do they give us hope, or do they give us pessimism?
I think it gives us hope because just as I think some hours ago, McConnell said, like, didn't he say he will give and we can have a higher debt ceiling and the government will not shut down. So
Well,
eventually, even if he said, well, democracy does not seem to be working, there's a lot of trouble finding the center. We sort of, I think, we sort of are getting to that point. And same with the 3 urban schools, it all seems different, but you just showed us and we discussed how one urban school can be applied to other cities and all the other schools as well.
Mhm.
So I think it's I think I can look forward to something positive, as long as we keep chugging along with the urban theories. I think there will be a theory that can apply to all three cities and all some other major cities as well.
But let me go back to my question. Will cities become the places, the context for positive change? Or will they fracture? Will they reflect the fractures we see in society today?
Won't it be a little bit of both? Like, since this is speculation on the future, depend on any context, like if doesn't take place in the city, where is it taking place? Like it will be like urban infrastructures and dynamics, the ones that, well, maybe with the digital world, not so much, but I think still it will be these structures, the ones that will enable people to gather around and to participate for creating a better future. But at the same time, there will be areas that will resemble the inequality and the segregatory practices that are taking place by some other politics that are being done. Like, is these dialectic iterative process that human history is just that we are just studying it in the urban aspect.
Other comments?
I'd agree with David. I think it's this contradiction where cities kind of are this cradle for progressive forces and change, but at the same time, they reproduce a lot of the segregation either by race or income, class, and it would be hard to see. I mean, that's kind of where comparative studies come in hand, right? If we see cases where these divides are somehow overcome, maybe that points us to the better future in terms of how we lay out the politics of the city and whatnot. But it's definitely a big question and an interesting one.
Others?
I was going to say that kind of similar to what other people have said, but that cities will become, because we've seen such a large amount of sorting now based on this urban rural divide of Democrat Republican, where the biggest cities, especially these three that we're studying, that we're talking about today, are something like 80-20 Democrat Republican. It seems like, and that trend doesn't seem to be reversing as much. It feels like the cities themselves are actually going to be much more ideologically coherent, even if they may not be in practice doing the same things that they preach, which is where I think the reproduction of segregation on income and race comes in. People might profess liberal ideals, progressive ideals, but when it comes to their actual day-to-day lives and things like allowing an affordable housing development to be built anywhere near you, they act much more conservative. But I think I'm kind of optimistic that eventually criticisms of that hypocrisy might break through somewhat, and you might be able to have a more functioning system within cities, just because there's so much ideological similarity.
I think it's entirely dependent on whether or not people decide they care about these issues. One of the ironies that's always struck me about urban politics, both Peterson in urban politics and Becker in economics point out that people can move out of cities really easily. And Becker goes, "This is this great," and Peterson goes, "This is this horrible." And I think that's the key. I mean, if the people decide they like the fragmentation, that this is the world they want to live in, they're going to move in the cities and it's going to be fragmented. If people decide they don't care about fragmentation, cities won't reflect that. It's completely dependent on individual agency. I don't think we can say the city will become this because we don't know what the people will become.
Mm-hmm. So,
And cities are probably more responsive to people than any other political institution.
there is a famous phrase that you probably have heard: all politics is, is local. I'm not sure what I can add to that, except that when we study the local, we're studying the most fundamental units at which societal conflicts work themselves out. And that we know in our society that people are in a contest, that people are fragmenting into communities that often are in conflict. We also know that people find a way to negotiate and to compromise. I would argue that in my argument for urban scholarship and its uniqueness is that we can see those things working themselves on the ground in an intimate context. And to me, that's what gives life to the profession that I chose all those years ago. So I think I will now just do a quick blurb. This is my latest contribution, along with my colleagues in the UIC department, then Evan McKenzie and Alba Alexander, Private Metropolis. In that book, well, we struggle with this question of which way the metropolis, is it fragmenting hopelessly? Or is there a space for negotiation? Some of the authors are very pessimistic, and I tend to be often pessimistic. Others are more optimistic, and that the contributions to this volume wrestle with that question. And your generation will unavoidably argue with that vital question of whether we can come together or we will inevitably be driven apart. Thank you for having me here today.
So Dennis, we're delighted that you were able to be part of the conversation and to lead us through all of this discussion. And we will continue throughout the semester to think about all these questions. We'll let you go now. And those students that I've already talked to about their papers, you can go.
And I'll be
But
here.
I will talk to the students who are still working on their research papers and trying to